Everyone loves it. To be honest, it's the only thing the only kind of rhubarb we eat here on the farm. We don't really eat the summer rhubarb. Just you get spoiled with the taste and tenderness of the forced rhubarbs. Everyone has the same reaction. They just love the color, they love the flavor, and it's rhubarb, but it's not rhubarb kind of.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show that brings together gardening, food, and the human story. I'm your host, Emma Biggs.
And I'm Stephen Biggs. We talk to creative food gardeners and farm and garden experts who break the rules and make new ones, too. Last summer, I had an interesting chat about rhubarb. My neighbor Susan had somebody in to install a fence, and I got chatting with him as I worked in my garden. From the way he spoke, I figured maybe he was from the north of England. Anyway, I offered him some of the rhubarb I was harvesting, and he said thanks, but that he grows his own. And then we got talking about the rhubarb growing that went on in his hometown in Yorkshire, England. He described the manure tea that one of the old-timers there taught him to use to get prize-winning rhubarb. And from there, we got onto the topic of something that Yorkshire is famous for, forced rhubarb. Grown indoors, in the dark, over the winter, giving tender stalks that are a bright red color. It's milder and more tender than its garden-grown counterpart. He talked about the candlelight harvesting, using the soft light of candles so as not to change the way that rhubarb grows. This was all fascinating to me because I like to dig up a hunk of rhubarb root to force in my basement in the winter. It's nice to pick my own rhubarb while there's still snow on the ground. The way this forcing works is that you're just relying on the stored energy in the rhubarb root to send up the stalks, and after a while that root's exhausted, but that's okay because a healthy rhubarb patch ought to be divided regularly as it expands. I was all set to track down a Yorkshire rhubarb grower for this episode to tell us all about the process because there's a long tradition there of commercial winter rhubarb forcing dating back to the 1800s. But then I heard about a grower near Toronto who forces rhubarb, and I had no idea it was done commercially here. Turns out they've been growing rhubarb on the family farm since 1900 and forcing rhubarb since 1910. Today, over the winter, they grow about 10,000 square feet of rhubarb indoors in forcing sheds. Brian French and his wife Jeanette run Lennox Farm in Dufferin County here in Ontario. It's a diverse operation with fruit, vegetables, herbs, and flowers. But back to that rhubarb. They even supply rhubarb juice to craft brewers and cider makers. Our chat today focuses on the forced rhubarb, and Brian shared some great pictures that I'll put up with the blog post for this episode. You can find that blog post at foodgardenlife.com, and check out those pictures if you want to see what forced rhubarb looks like and what the production looks like. Just go to the podcast section on foodgardenlife.com. You can find Brian online at lennoxfarm.ca. And now, here's our chat with Brian French from Lennox Farm. Brian, thanks for joining us today on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
I was delighted to find out that there's somebody forcing rhubarb not too far from here in Toronto. Maybe to get us started, can you tell us just a little bit about your farm?
We're in Melanchthon, Ontario, which is about an hour and a half north of Toronto. We grow roughly 200 acres of market garden vegetables, 85 of that being rhubarb. We've been growing rhubarb since my great-great-grandfather around 1900, and we also force rhubarb in our sheds in the wintertime, and we've been doing that since around 1910.
That's over a century of rhubarb and rhubarb forcing.
That's correct.
So you're doing both, from what you just said, you're doing both the forced rhubarb and then, I'll call it normal rhubarb, normal in-season rhubarb out in the field.
Yeah, so we'll start picking in the sheds mid to late February, and we have 4 sheds, so we kind of bring them on one after the other, kind of stagger them until the last one will kick in the last week of April, and we'll pick that one until mid to late May, and we usually start outside mid-May, so it kind of just carries on one after the other.
I bet people are wondering, well, what does a rhubarb shed look like? Could you describe that for us?
We have a few different styles. We have one called a coverall building. It's just a fabric roofed hoop building that we've insulated the inside of it. Then we also have some old pole barn that was here when we moved here, and then we built a nicer barn for it. But the main thing it needs to be is dark, because it grows in the dark. We just have lights for harvesting and watering and planting. Insulated, and we have a heat exchanger in there to keep the air moving and keep the moisture out, and then a heater. So there's not much to it, but it is a fairly large expense for what you get out of it.
I imagine. So with the heater, what temperature are you keeping it at approximately?
To hold the best color, it's around 10, 11 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
Any warmer, it'll start to get a little paler on you, or any colder, it could split. So 10 to 11 is about the sweet spot.
Okay. And I'm curious about light, because I've seen pictures of the old-fashioned way of forcing rhubarb in England with candles. It sounds like you're not into the whole candle routine then.
I don't want to say it's a hoax. We've tried it, and it's quite difficult. And to be honest, we have very low light when we're picking. It's not very many lights in the shed. So to me, I don't want to step on their toes, but I think it's just more for a tourist attraction than anything. I've actually been in the sheds in England and actually seen they don't look much different than mine. So. Okay.
Yeah, it's probably a fairly romantic thing to add into a tourist visit, but I could see where it's not too practical.
Oh, I tried it in one of our little sheds, and to move the thing around, and you can only see about a foot around where the candle is. It wasn't very efficient. So.
Okay. Let's back up a little bit. So as you're getting started then in mid to late February, what's going on? Where are those roots coming from, and what's being done to them?
So we have 2 varieties that we like to force. One is Sutton Seedless, and the other is Victoria. They're both quite old varieties. So we'll grow those in the field for two summers, and we don't harvest them in the field at all. We just tend to them, keep the weeds out, make sure they're healthy, and then we'll dig them out the end of October. And we fill all 4 sheds the end of October. And to force rhubarb, you need that dormancy period, which I believe is around 40 days at 5 degrees or less. Make it kind of kick in to want to grow again. So we leave that till first week of January, and we'll start the first shed up. And the first one always takes a little longer to come out of dormancy. It takes about 7 weeks before harvest. And then as you get closer to spring, that goes down to about 3 weeks on the last shed.
And so they're all those sheds are prepared at the same time, but you're just bringing them online at different times by applying heat in succession.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I think for home gardeners, maybe who've had rhubarb growing, they might picture this as such a deep-rooted, woody root, I guess, when you go to dig it up. So when you're potting up your sheds, how deep down are you digging up these rhubarb plants?
So a 2-year-old root, we prefer 2-year-olds for a few reasons. They're actually not overly large, and they'll produce a larger stalk. So the root size I would describe as anywhere from 40 to 80 pounds. The size of a basketball to slightly bigger than that. So we have to go down, I think our digger goes down roughly 10 inches to get down underneath to dig it up properly. So
you really are getting a good chunk of root with it then.
Yeah, you want to keep as many of the tubers as you can on the root, because that is where the energy is coming from. So.
Now, what happens after you've forced it? Do you keep those roots and charge them up again by growing them, or do you compost them?
Yeah, they get composted. You forced all the energy you can out of that tuber, so there's really nothing left to save. When you bring them in, I would describe the tuber as maybe the firmness of a sweet potato or something.
Yeah.
And then when you're done with it, it's softer than a sponge, so there's really nothing left in there for worth saving.
I'm curious too, Brian, just about how people react when they first come across this product. What have people said to you when they haven't before had forced rhubarb and you give it to them for the first time?
Everyone loves it. To be honest, it's the only thing the only kind of rhubarb we eat here on the farm. We don't really eat the summer rhubarb. Just you get spoiled with the taste and tenderness of the forced rhubarb. So everyone has the same reaction. They just love the color, they love the flavor, and it's rhubarb, but it's not rhubarb kind of.
Yeah. Well, for people who haven't seen it before, can you just describe what it looks like compared to your typical field-grown rhubarb?
Yeah. So it's our rhubarb is quite a nice red color, and the stalk, it's really tender. The skin is really tender on it. You have to be really careful picking it, and the leaf is smaller than your hand, and it's yellow because it doesn't have that sunlight to do the photosynthesis. So it's quite, I won't say less sour, it's less tart, I guess you could call it. It has a nice rhubarb flavor, but it's just not as tart as the outside rhubarb. So it's just a nice product altogether.
Okay. When you sell it, do you leave those leaves on there?
Yeah, we like to leave the leaf on just because it looks amazing with it on there. That's the main reason we put these heat exchangers in our sheds up until the mid-1980s. The way to get rid of the heat and moisture was you just vented it right outside. And to control the moisture in between, they had to spray fungicides on. So we adapted some heat exchangers from hog barns to get rid of the moisture and retain about 85% of the heat. So when doing that, we haven't had to spray anything for quite a long time. So,
wow, that's interesting how modern technology can then reduce your other inputs.
Yep.
How do you sell a premium product like forced rhubarb? Coming up, Brian tells us where his harvest goes, and he also has tips for gardeners who want to grow rhubarb at home. That's coming up in just a moment. A shout out today to Tina, who got in touch about tips for growing giant pumpkins. Thanks, Tina. And I'm glad that pumpkin episode in the fall inspired you. By the way, here's what I suggested to Tina. Check out Giant Vegetable Growers of Ontario. It's a not-for-profit, and when you join, they send you seed for giant veggies, including pumpkins. They also have some really cool field events, so go to gvgo.ca. And one other thought, there's a famous Canadian giant pumpkin, Dill's Giant, grown by Howard Dill in Nova Scotia, and you'll find it in a number of seed catalogs. If you decide to grow your own pumpkins, one thing is don't start them too early because they get very lanky and outgrow the pots. So if it were me, I'd start them no more than 2 or 3 weeks before planting them into the garden. Because pumpkins are heat-loving, I wouldn't transplant them into the garden right on your average last frost date. I'd give a bit of extra time in case there's a late frost, and also to let that soil heat up. But having said that, I have seen hardcore giant pumpkin growers set them out earlier in a temporary greenhouse-like structure to protect them. Are you intrigued by the idea of forcing rhubarb? If so, check out those pictures I mentioned that Brian kindly shared. They accompany the blog post for this episode at foodgardenlife.com. And I will also put up in the notes for that episode a link to an article that we have about forcing rhubarb at home. We also have a new post this week on the website about beets, specifically about how to cook them into one of my favorite soups, a delicious beet borscht, like Mum used to make. And whenever I make borscht, hers is the gold standard that I compare mine to. You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show that brings together gardening, food, and the human story, with your hosts Emma Biggs and me, Stephen Biggs. Now, back to our chat with Brian French from Lennox Farm. How do you sell the rhubarb, or where? Is it a farm gate product? Are you shipping to retailers?
We kind of do everything. We have a farm market here that will open the 1st of March, and we'll have a rhubarb in there. Also, we ship to, it mostly goes to small independent grocers and like other farm market type things until we get into a little more production, and then some of the higher end independent stores would carry it as well.
And I'll put your website with the notes for the podcast for anybody who's in the Toronto area and maybe thinking about checking out that farm market in March as it opens.
Yeah, that's great. We always get some kind of newspaper or podcast ask about it every spring, and once people hear that, they always email and call, and I'm happy to try my best to find a retailer close to where they live. So
super. As we wrap up, I wonder if you have any rhubarb growing tips for home gardeners who are now thinking rhubarb, having heard you talk about this beautiful forced rhubarb, but also about your normal field-grown rhubarb. What would you tell home gardeners just getting into rhubarb?
So if you just purchase the root itself, then the rule of thumb is to not pick it for 2 years, to let that root establish and get quite healthy. And as we pick our own, we only maybe harvest 60% of the stalks, just to keep that root healthy and strong. Don't over harvest, and another thing is to keep all the weeds and grass away from it. That's about the only thing that can bring pests in. You keep your garden clean, and you shouldn't have any issues with it. And it also loves manure, so if you can find some manure when you're done harvesting, throw a bag of manure on top of every root, and you should have a good crop every year.
Okay, Brian, thanks very much for joining us on the podcast. I'm getting excited about forced rhubarb this coming winter.
Yeah, me too, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Bye now.
Yeah, bye.
That was Brian French from Lennox Farm, and you can find Brian online at lennoxfarm.ca. What did you think? I was fascinated to get a deeper understanding of the forcing process. And something that really jumped out at me was the way they adopted the use of heat exchangers. Heat exchangers designed for hog barns as a way to lower the humidity so that there's no need to spray fungicides. As we wrap up today's episode, I'm thinking about Mum's rhubarb pie. And you want to know what the secret to a really awesome rhubarb pie is? Add some orange zest. And even better, you can add some of the juice from an orange too. Squeeze that same orange that you take the zest from and add in the juice. I tell you, that makes a fantastic rhubarb pie. It's such a great combination. The podcast is back next Thursday, and we're heading to the Pacific Northwest to talk all about cold hardy citrus and citrus in pots. We'll be chatting with Sam Hubert from One Green World Nursery. Do you have feedback or show ideas? Or just want to connect? Find us at foodgardenlife.com or on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, where our handle is foodgardenlife.
And you can find me on my website, emmabiggs.ca, and on Instagram as emmabiggs_grows.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show. I'm Stephen Biggs.
And I'm Emma Biggs. Thanks for tuning in.